So, the book we will be presenting today, Écrire l'histoire, so was written with my colleague Frédéric. In the first part, I will set out the broad framework of our research, where it comes from, what it has uncovered, what question it raises. And then Frédéric will develop two main questions, an examination of the concept of digital diplomatics, and the reflection on what we should be teaching the next generation of historians. Before discussing the digital turn and what it has transformed, I suggest we take a brief journey back in time, a short return to what the daily work of historians was, and in many ways still is. So let us begin with the library. The library, let's see the PowerPoint. The library occupies a central place in the imaginary of the profession. Think of all the photographs of historians, maybe yourself, posed before their own personal libraries or shelves, or even the inventory of personal libraries offered by major figures of the discipline recently in France, Michel Perrault, or even Marc Bloch. Last weeks, we could see there has been a lot of works about their libraries. This imaginary has remained remarkably stable, yet the actual practices of reading have been profoundly transformed. Electronic documentation now represents most of university and research library budgets. At the heart of historical work, however, lies above all the relationship with archives. So let's consider what François Furet wrote in L'Atelier de l'Histoire, a very famous book in France. Sorry. So he wrote in L'Atelier de l'Histoire about the reading room, describing it as the holy of holies, the place where the historians consult finding aids, request to see a box of archive, unfolds bundle of documents, and take notes. After that, we can talk about Langlois and Segnobos' method with the index card method. It was a very famous manual, became a classic in France, very emblematic of a moment of professionalization of our discipline. So we can already see that here we have a question that will accompany us, the effects of working routines and tools on the production of historical knowledge. Yet, this world of paper was no stranger to technology. In France, we can talk about the medievist and ordinateur from the 80s onwards, which bears witness to historians' early interest in computing. And it also reflects the enthusiasm, even optimism, that microfilms or macrofiche could generate at this time. But at this time, the instrumentation remained concentrating on the archival side. It did not entirely transform the working chain. In the reading room, manual transcription remained essential. It was during this year that Arlette Farge, maybe you know this book, published Le Goût de l'Archive, in English, The Allure of the Archive. And this book makes the sensory and emotional experience of the archive the pivot of the profession's meaning. It has become a reference well beyond academic circles. We could do a survey to know if you, know that book. That would be pretty funny during the question. It is from there that Frédéric and I set out to reflect on the transformations of the craft over the past 20 years. So this is our starting point. Very simple. What becomes of the experience of the archive in a digital age? How does the sensory, emotional, and material relationship to sources evolve? We wanted, at that time, to offer an updated account of these practices, a kind of contemporary mirror of Le Goût de l'Archive. So we coordinated a first collaborative volume. Only online. We will go back to that later. It brought together diverse accounts of archivists, librarians, and researchers working on very different objects. It's still online if you want to see what it is. So it discussed about medieval parchments, radio archives, data streams, very different objects. But very quickly, we encountered a limitation of our assumptions. Presuming an uniformly shared taste for the archive did not hold. The book showed, this first book, on the contrary, highly diverse and sometimes contrasting experiences. A taste for the archive was sometimes quite relative. This is why we shifted towards a broader investigation into historians' culture in the digital age. How do historians search for, gather, and read their documentation today? We looked at how research is actually practiced. In seminars, on social media, we could see glimpses and fragments of research as it unfolds, through conversation with archivists and librarians, by organizing our own workshop, especially on the reading room and search engines, by observing students at work, by gathering statistics and reports, studying the methodology sections of the recent dissertations, and so on. So we had a lot of data. If you want to know more, let us know. The aim was to identify and inventory the multiple historical practices of the digital era. But we maintained close attention to the question of sources, which occupies a very particular place in the historical discipline. This work culminated in the publication of Écrire l'Histoire, and you have the book on the PowerPoint. In the course of our investigation, we became aware of an entire set of everyday gestures and habits that were never considered research gestures. Photographing archival collection, running a search in a search engine, downloading images from a library website, consulting finding aids remotely. Practices so common that they appear in no methodological chapter. They have become too ordinary to be noticed. This is what we have called discrete digital practices. These discrete digital practices unfold in the shadow of digital humanities because they are digital, but not considered as such, without anyone always reflecting on their methodological implication. The digital humanities, in France at least, have sometimes been perceived as synonymous with quantitative approaches, heavy instrumentation, pulling towards research engineering. So it has been a problem because it was as if common everyday work was not concerned by all this digital question. So digital humanities have not really addressed the low tech, that lower end of the digital spectrum where most of historians' everyday practices actually are. So maybe we could start with a preliminary inventory of some of these practices. First, the traditional reading room. Work in the traditional reading room has changed profoundly. Archivists describe a decline of in-person consultation, giving way to intensive photography campaigns. Abby Mullen spoke 10 years ago of thousands of photographs accumulated during a single session. Our toolkit now assembles laptop, smartphone, external hard drive, scanner, and this at itself already changed considerably since 10 years. So far from the image of the researcher bent over bundles of documents with pencil and paper, the contemporary reading room is a space of combination between paper and the digital. Alongside photography, historians now also work in virtual reading rooms and draw on digitized corpora. The very term reading room has become uncertain, given the diversity of the actors who provide them, from public institutions to private individuals to associations putting archives online. This diversity of actors corresponds to a diversity of data, more or less well inventoried or described because of the resource and skills of those making them available. Furthermore, the use of search engines has become massive, an entry point for many research endeavors. And we can talk about to an additional layer now, portals, meta search engines, which retrace specific questions about queries and corpora boundaries. The example of Google Ngram Viewer, I don't know if you know Google Ngram Viewer, is very instructive. It's a tool of considerable potential, but it suffers from OCR errors, vocabulary anachronism, opaque parameters, and dependence on the language of the corpus. Our habits of working with sources have also changed considerably. Accumulating thousands of images makes document management necessary. Researchers turn to specialized software such as Tropi or to tools like Excel. Photographs are described and enriched with metadata. The information they contain can become rows in databases. We lose material information that given by the sensory experience of the archive, but we gain layers of information added to document. And we have sometimes a funny example of, of what we can do with this new manipulation. As Isabelle Poutrin say, it's on, I think it's on Twitter or Blue Sky, I don't remember. She writes, I didn't read every page. The simplest thing is to take the photograph standing up and read them later on a large screen. So it's an example of what difference it makes. The very nature of working with sources has changed. The process, in fact, designates several gestures: opening a box, taking stock of its content, deciding whether to keep a trace, and transcribing. Photography makes immediate transcription seemingly less necessary. And at that point, choices are now very varied. Transcribing intensively, transcribing partially, describing with voice dictation, scanning and using OCR. So there are not two opposed categories, but a gradient of intermediate practices. Yet this issue is fundamental. Transcription, far from being a merely documentary operation, is an intellectual process. Copying out a document is a way of appropriating the language of the source, its word, and thereby contributing to the construction of historical knowledge. So what is lost and what is gained in this shift deserves to be raised. The final stage of historical work is the writing and dissemination of historical knowledge. Yes. Writing has been transformed over the last few decades. The process itself, erasing words, rewriting without leaving traces, the media, the use of Word, Markdown, LaTeX, reference management software, etc. The most recent development is that of generative artificial intelligence, which, thank you, directly affects writing and its relationship to sources. A major transformation is that of the hyperlink, which brings source and historical text closer together. With a single click, it becomes possible to open a document underpinning a demonstration if it's digitized and online. Stable citation tools, permalinks, DOIs, maintain the founding principle of the discipline, the ability for the reader to return to the term, to the source, and retrace the intellectual journey. So a new form of augmented writing and reading are emerging. Hypertext links text together. Some writings integrate layers of data, but others present themselves as traditional while being published in journals that no longer print their issues. Another category of discrete digital practices has emerged in recent years and is gaining ground, those linked to the use of generative AI.
So basically, in terms of generative AI, I think historians are today like Monsieur Jourdain in Moliere's Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme. They're practicing AI without knowing it. One of the discrete practice that Caroline described, and which is less and less discrete today because it's quite documented now, it's the fact of taking pictures of your archive. Most of the times, lots of people are using directly their smartphones. The lenses of the smartphones, even if it's sound like the best camera in the world are usually not very good. So you've got a series of algorithms that have been trained usually with machine learning to enhance your images and have proper pictures in the end. So when you're using smartphones in the reading room, basically you already introduced some AI in the reading room and in your work. Here I mean AI in quite loose sense. Let's say that it's machine and deep learning, which include language models, vision models, chatbots, etc. So it's quite wide range of technology. If you look at all the different steps of the workflow that involves historians' pictures of primary sources, for instance, there might be some sort of AI use, explicit or not, at almost all levels, starting with the OCR process, for instance. We have, I hope, Caroline, we will not disagree with that, but that we have encountered practices that are super strange and that can involve through OCR very use of AI without any thought of thinking. For instance, there is one colleague who is putting all their sources on Google Drive. So Google behind this will do OCR automatically. That is based on machine learning, and then our colleague can do search by keyword.
That's my example.
That's your example, exactly. Yes, that's right. But it's so striking as an example. No. And someone someone you met. But it's an example that is so striking about the fact that we're using the AI quite commonly without noticing it, and with consequences. What is the rate of error in the OCR from Google, for instance? We don't know that. And if we don't know these rates, if there is a systematic error in one word, then you don't find what you're looking for if this word is your keyword. But if you look more generally at a historian's workflow, then again, you can use AI potentially at all stages. We have done a survey, because I don't think there is a survey today about the use of AI among historians, at least not in France. We did a small survey at the C²DH, basically 60 people and not only historians, so it's not a lot, but it's quite a good example, I think, 2 years ago. And the adoption of chatbots, notably, but not only, was massive. Without any policy encouraging it at the level of the C²DH. And with very diverse uses, and from the discovery of sources to the writing process. So we are not asking chatbot to write for us at the C²DH, don't worry. But for instance, we have some of our colleagues are using chatbots to encourage a sort of creativity in writing. So they will not copy paste what the chatbot will write, but it will encourage them to be a bit more creative in the way they're writing. More and more we can use them to interpret source. More and more we can use them to anything that can involve a cognitive process in our workflow. So use of AI today is a digital discrete practice and is among the historians' work becoming really, I think, predominant.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the most interesting conclusions of our work is the gap between the transformation of practices and their near invisibility in publications. The formats for presenting sources and corpora have barely evolved. The shelf mark of a document, consulted entirely online, continues to be cited without the link. There is no visible distinction between digitized documentation and documentation seen in person. Search engines are never mentioned in description of how corpora were assembled. Archivists and librarians are thanked, but not developers, nor the infrastructure that designs and maintains the interface on which most time was spent. This silence is explained largely by the power of the imaginary surrounding the profession. One of the commonplaces of the historian's narrative is to recount the emotion felt before the archive, to make this experience the pivot of the pleasure and meaning of the craft. There is also a valorization of a form of solitary genius against the background of objects marking their belonging to the humanities, the library, the book, the archive box. So this imaginary is difficult to reconcile with an account of digital gestures. It does not encourage one to say, for example, that one has barely ever consulted archival collection in a reading room because everything was digitized. So the said and unsaid of historical investigation can be explained in part by the sociology of the profession and its self-representations. So here lies one of the central stakes of our approach, making visible what has become invisible by sheer familiarity. These discrete practices raise multiple methodological questions. Oh, sorry, picture of tests. The first concerns gestures that has become common, typing keywords into a search engine. This practice is inherited from a general digital culture transferred into a scientific context. It offers considerable advantages. It provides a rapid overview of the documentation available in the subject, a kind of aerial photograph that breaks down documentary silos and bypasses classification by theme. But it also creates a thematic and decontextualized assemblage. A keyword may be present in metadata describing very different documents from entirely different collections. This decontextualization may lead to a loss of awareness of the world within the corpus. As Claire-Lise Gaillard said in the text she gave to her first book, so we can read it. This corpus of documents exists only because the search was run. It has no other reason to exist than our research. The keyword entry point short-circuits the thematic approach one might have when working through an archival finding aid. The time saved is enormous for the historians, but this efficiency comes at a cost. It changed the way we access sources, and this must be kept in mind. Building a corpus from keyword searches requires competence in querying and an understanding of how search engines work. Knowing how to use a search engine is itself an expert gesture. One must know the vocabulary that will yield relevant documentation. One might almost speak of a false natural language. Formulating a query is already an act of scholarly expertise. We argue that this expertise should be made visible. Publication should specify the queries used, the keywords, the boundaries of the collection, everything that made it possible to assemble the corpora. This would shed light on the functioning of algorithms. It would show the obstacles encountered in the research process. It would render visible that expertise acquired over long months of familiarization with search interfaces. Above all, it would open up the possibility of cumulative and collective knowledge of their working, particularly useful when facing black boxes, such as Google Books. The logical consequence would be a renewal of documentary criticism, applying the principle of critical method to algorithms and reflecting on the ways in which search interfaces guide our behavior and on the paths they open or conceal. Another question is digital diplomatics, but this is for you, Frédéric.
So on this slide, you see a screenshot of Adamo, which is from now beta version of a portal of the French National Archive to find digital documents. And basically, it's also here discussing the question of le minutier central électronique, basically a sort of centralized repository for born digital, and not only born digital, and digitized notarial acts. Notarial acts are super important in history because basically it's an extremely rich source. And it's although the notarial acts are also basically questioning what is a proof, what is the original, because a notarial act is supposed to prove something. It's also quite interesting because the first article published in France in in a big journal, let's say, was and using a computer or mainframe, or at least a mechanographical device, was published at the end of the 1950s in the Annals and was based on the exploitation of the use of notarial acts. It was an article by François Furet and Adeline Domar, and it was a sort of big data of the time. So this question of the notarial acts and digital diplomatics are quite today linked. Basically, the question of the source, of the critique of the source, of the original source, it's a question that is asked at least since Mabillon in the 17th century. And that's part of the core of diplomatics. So for Mabillon, diplomatics is basically the combined study of language discourse, the materiality of writing to get information, so source criticism. But it's also a link, there's also a link to the condition of the production of a source. So place, time, sciences, repetition, organization of the source, etc. And those principles should still be kept at the heart of historians' reasoning and methods when they're criticizing, when they're doing source criticism. But in the digital era, there are disruptions that are introduced in those principles. The first is the question of the materiality. Digital artifacts are material, that's sure. There is a link to materiality, but this link is changing. If you copy an information in the digital era, you can copy it to a new material device. So the link between the content and the device it's not broken, but is changing and can always change. The backup will usually be done on another kind of device. So the materiality of writing partly escaped the digitized format. So the object that we observe is a sort of abstraction in the sense that we can observe it without looking at the materiality of its support. Then usually digital age documents, so digitized documents or born digital documents, both of them, undergo a sort of second layer of processing on top of the original cataloging. It's called redocumentarization. We add metadata, a strat of metadata to let the user understand the object's trajectory. Without this work, this new layer of documentation about the digitized artifact, the born digital artifact, lots of documents cannot be findable and cannot be understood, because there is here the question of the context. And then the digital era, in terms of archival science, it's the end of the respect des fonds. I don't know how to translate it into German, this expression, or into English, because in English it's the series, and it's not the same principle. But the respect des fonds, it's basically the basis of the European archival science. And through the use of keywords, through the move to digital records management, which comes more from UK, Canada, US archival tradition, then historians can use and decontextualized sources, and sources with the link with their, let's say, documentary rule is broken, basically. And in this sense, general knowledge about the archival fund that you're working on is really crucial, because otherwise you may lose context, and if you lose context, you lose some knowledge and some information. I will develop a bit the case of the of web archiving, because I'm more comfortable with that kind of sources, because I'm more today working on born digital sources than on digitized sources. And born digital sources are also concerned by all this, and there is even another adaptation to be done. When our colleague archivists are harvesting born digital sources, they also need to archive supplementary traces to explain the history of those born digital sources. Timestamps, for instance. Sometimes digital seals to prove that there is no original that would guarantee the creation dates and the integrity of the information. If we look at web archiving, Niels Brugger speaks not about born digital sources, but about reborn digital heritage, because web archive must be recreated from fragments of the indexation process. When you archive a web page, first you need to define what is a web page, which is quite already quite complex. But in fact, a web page is something that assembles different fragments of different technological or different documents, let's say. Then you need to rebuild this, and you will have a sort of artifact that is probably the web page as it existed, but it cannot be sure. So that leads us to another question that is quite hard in the digital era, which is the limitation of the original source. Seeking the original or authentic source isn't suited to all, isn't something pertinent for all natively born digital archives. Then, and that is still a question that is not clearly answered if I trust the archivist I'm speaking with, there is the question of the harvesting and then the critique of feeds. Digital sources can be feeds. I have worked on Twitter. Twitter is a feed, was, because Twitter has used to exist, is dead. But basically, my work as a historian in Twitter was to transform a feed into something stable that I could work on. And that involves choices that must be documented, otherwise you might lose a sense of what you did. All this should be taken into account in our own practices and when historians themselves build corpora, which we all do almost today, and turn sources into data, sources whether digitized or born digital. They should document their collection and assembly process to ensure traceability of the corpus, including tracing the imperfection of the corpus, what is missing, so that other users, other historians in the future can judge what to make of it if they want to reuse it. That means also, for instance, to go back to the example of the OCR, which is something quite important today. It's trying to evaluate the error margin of the OCR and what correction choices have been made. If you're using transcribers, for instance, it means to explain also how you train transcribers to then recognize the handwritten text of your resources. That's oh. Another strong question that we have tried to tackle a bit is what should we teach? Because all this should be translated somewhere in some ways or another. Teaching, we need to train the future historians. We need also to train all in our life as historians. What should we teach in terms of computing, in terms in the digital era, etc.? This question is asked at least for 58 years in the case of France. Why 58 years? Because in July 1968, so almost day by day, Emmanuel Laura-Ladurie published a famous essay, famous at least in France, called La fin des érudits, in le Nouvel Observateur. Everyone remembers the stance, l'historien de demain sera programmeur ou ne sera pas, so tomorrow historian will be a developer or will not be. And we most of the time forget that this text is a lot about teaching how to use how to use mainframes, so teaching to history students how to use mainframes, the computers of that time. Since then, let's say that speaking about history teaching and computers, then about history teaching in the digital era, today about history teaching in the age of AI, we made the equivalent of entering a minefield.
Yeah.
Why? Because there are many, if you look a bit at the history of historians speaking about teaching history and computers, let's say, there are many contradictory injunctions, notably since the 1990s, coming from historians, but also sometimes from the universities or from more political authorities. There is some injunction today to teach AI, for instance. Many historians have tried to get their voice heard. In the case of France, it's Jean-Philippe Genet in the 1990s. Well, from the end of the 1980s to almost to today, because he's still sometimes speaking. Philippe Rivière in 2012, historien à l'âge numérique. And here in 2019, DHIA 8 with a real dynamic that was basically broken by COVID. So there is a history of what should we teach and with very different conclusions, let's say. Well, today still adapting historians training is still something discussed. We know we need to help students navigating a shifting documentary landscape to show them how to make visible the implication of our methodological practices, to show them how the new questions opened by massive data and distant reading are being dealt with. And we do have a general responsibility not to leave future generations unprepared for natively digital sources. To those challenges, our answers, or our collective answers, have been quite diverse. In the 1980s, 1990s, there are lots of uneven situations with quite performance courses at the Pirée, at Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne, for instance. Some more general teaching here and there in computing and humanities, I think the example of Rennes, for instance. In the last decade, digital courses have since become a bit more common, but usually they are still an option. You're not obliged to follow them. And it's, let's be frank, not always considered really legit by some of our colleagues. What we propose in the book is not a computing course, nor a digital tool course, but a series of sequences, let's say, that anchor digital questions to our digital disciplinary problems. And basically 3 sets. The first set would aim at digital culture of history in continuity with epistemology and historiography, not a specialization module. A second set would be maybe later in the bachelor, for instance, would introduce documentary landscape, the transformation of archive, and a last set would update fundamental competencies, critique, analysis, source processing. So that should be adapted to every tradition that can change from one university to the other, and of course from one country to the other. We did not suggest to introduce code. That's a long discussion between the both of us. But at least I think I surrender to Caroline's opinion, and I surrender to Caroline's opinion because of AI. It's coding, the status of coding is very different today with live coding. There are lots of obstacles to change the way we teach and to include digital methods in it, not only methods, digital culture. The diversity of students, not all will become secondary school teachers. There are many more jobs you can get after studying history, so they don't have necessarily the same needs. A quite limited general digital culture of the teachers and of the learners. That's why we need also to teach the teachers, to train the teachers. And the fact that we need to follow the pace of innovation. I mean, if in 2022 you had to rework a diploma and to think about, let's say, a digital course somewhere, you would not have taken the same decision as today. And in the end, renewing the initial training of young historians should be an occasion for us to renew also our relationship to primary sources, to archives, but also to writing.
Another question raised by Discreet digital practices is an ethical question about the visibility and recognition of everyone's contribution to research. Many of these practices are carried out by those whom Françoise Baquet has called the small hands of research. Do we speak more of those who stand behind the many digital products that are library catalog, websites presenting institution and research projects, databases, open archive portals? Click workers exist in large numbers behind the scenes of research institutions, without their names always being mentioned, without the users of digital products ever seeing them, sometimes without even being aware of their existence. Technicians, research engineers, assistant postdoctoral researchers are often delegated the tasks of corpus preparation, photography, database encoding, and the dissemination of the result, blog posts, communication materials. Analysis of acknowledgement sections shows how little these contributions are recognized. So discrete digital practices raise the same question already posed in digital humanities: how to value and make visible everyone's contribution while avoiding solo authorship that perpetuates the myth of individual genius. Solutions already exist. We mentioned them in the book. One is the Collaborators Bill of Rights. I don't know if you know this this Bill of Rights, but maybe I should give the link. Or the credit taxonomy, contributor roles taxonomy, is another solution. It systematically distinguishes the different forms of contribution to a research project or publication. Another ethical question is to ask if the choice of our investigation, of our research, is neutral. The choice of our research. There is a tendency that we have seen to adapt research topics to what is known to be quickly available online or photographable, and that produce effects of over-researched areas and under-researched areas. What is online is more visible, more explored, the press, for instance. So this is a mirror of the geography of unequal resources and expertise. The dynamics of online research make it easier to discover what was designed to be discoverable and the best identified collections. So it's a visibility loop. In France, these choices of research topics are linked to the difficult working conditions of the students, who often have very little time and money. And on the side of researcher and even teenager researcher, research time is also sometimes reduced due to administrative tasks. So it is important to take into account the material conditions of research and the way in which they shape our choices in front of digitized corpora. There is also a necessary reflection on the political context of corpus choices. Digitization makes it possible to develop entire research projects on countries of the global south without ever traveling there, and we must ask ourselves whether it is either appropriate or fair or good if we think about the language and the new possibilities of translation, of archive, and so on. So decisions about digitization are political choices. They define what will be visible and what will remain in the shadows. The voices overrepresented in online collection condition the question that historians are able to ask. This logic applies equally to generative artificial intelligence, which extends and amplifies these biases. I don't know if you want to say something about that. No? Okay. Who produces the training data? What types of text, languages, and culture are represented in the online collections we know? So becoming aware of these stakes means extending the source criticism that historians have always practiced, applying it to the new technological layers that now stand between the researcher and the documentation. The digital diplomatics we advocate, the critical analysis of interfaces and algorithm that mediates our access to sources, in this sense, a necessary extension of historical method.
At the conclusion, and I will be fast because we are running out of time. I will come back to a discussion that we had with Thorsten Hiltmann 2 weeks ago at a conference about AI history through AI that was co-organized with the German Historical Institute in Washington, the C²DH, and Thorsten Chair, and others. And we noticed that we received quite a lot of papers from Germany, and that's excellent, but very few from France. In fact, two, and we kept only one, one about the world famous Clavert. And we shortly discussed, Thorsten, if you remember, maybe the gap between the French historiography and the German historiography in terms of AI in this case, but I think in general, maybe in terms of digital history. I come from international history and from monetary history, and in those domains, I have seen conferences in this place at the Institut Historique Allemand, where basically there was a very strong French-German cooperation between historians to tackle those subjects. And my conclusion would be that maybe, and even if Mareke, since that conference in 2010, I think is a lot working to bridge the French historiography and the German historiography in terms of digital history. Even if Mareke worked a lot on that, I think there are bridges with those two historiographies in digital history that should be, that more bridges should be built between those two historiographies. So if you look in digital history, because if you look at many topics, those historiography can be quite, sometimes a bit in opposition, but that sometimes quite complementary. And as we are at 47 minutes, I will stop.
Thank you very much.